Dear ones, now we can have an analysis of the poem Death the Leveler by James Shirley. James Shirley belonged to the Elizabethan period. You know, Elizabethan period is generally acclaimed as the golden age of English language and literature. William Shakespeare belonged to this particular age. James Shirley was the last among the Elizabethans. He was born in the year 1596 and died in 1666. He was a schoolmaster, cleric, and a convert to the Church of Rome. He wrote some 40 dramas and a number of poems. But as a poet and dramatist, he suffers by comparison with his predecessors. The closing of the theatre in 1642 put an end to his dramatic activities. In 1646, he collected and published his poems. Many of them had appeared originally as songs in his dramas. Death the Leveler is one of them. It rises above the rest and is one among the greatest lyrics of English literature. It is a funeral chant which occurs at the end of his drama, The Contention of Ajax and Ulysses. It is sung by Calchas, the seer, over the dead body of Ajax. A critic has rightly said that this poem would preserve the memory of Shirley even if all his dramas were lost. Ajax and Ulysses were two of the greatest Greek heroes in the Trojan War. When the Greek Achilles died, Ajax and Ulysses contended for the weapons of the dead hero. The weapons were awarded to Ulysses. Ajax was maddened with rage and killed a flock of sheep, thinking them the sons of Atreus, who had given the preference to Ulysses. Ajax then stabbed himself from shame. The poem brings out the idea that death is a great leveler. It makes no difference between the great and the small, the rich and the poor. At the end of the poem, the poet asserts that only the good deeds of man will survive him. The solemn, balanced myth of the poem gives an added intensity to the subduing power of death. Deeds speak louder than words. Good deeds will be remembered forever. The central idea of the poem Death the Leveler is the vanity and impermanence of earthly glory and power. Death knows no distinction and carries off all alike, high and low, rich and poor, strong and weak, reducing them all to dust. It is only the memory of the good deeds done during our lifetime that will remain forever. Now please understand a stanza-wise summary of the poem Death the Leveler. The glories of our blood and state are shadows, not substantial things. There is no armor against fate. Death lays his icy hand on kings, scepter and crown must tumble down, and in the dust be equal made with the poor crooked sheath and spade. The glories of birth, parentage, and social position are all unreal and insubstantial. There is no protection against man's fate. Even the most powerful kings cannot escape the cold touch of death. Kings and rulers come to dust as surely as peasants and workers. Death makes them all equal. Now, the second stanza. Some men with swords may reap the fields and plant fresh laurels where they kill, but their strong nerves at last must yield. They tame but one another still, early or late they stoop to fate, and must give up their murmuring breath when the pale captives creep to death. There are men who kill their enemies in large number and place their emblems of victory on the battlefield. Soldiers continue to kill and tame one another, but all of them must sooner or later bow before their inevitable fate. Very soon their power will become weak and they will become the sickly prisoners of death. Now, the third and last stanza. The garlands wither on your brow, then boast no more your mighty deeds upon death's purple altar now. See where the victim bleeds. Your heads must come to the cold tomb. Only the actions of the just smell sweet and blossom in their dust. The glories of victory are withering away. The victors need not boast of their great deeds. They can very well see the altar of death, which is purple with human blood. Many previous victors have already become victims of death. The living victors are to join them soon. The last two lines of the poem bring out a moral. It is only the actions of the just men which will survive them. The poet compares these actions to sweet smelling flowers blossoming in the dust to which the just men have gone. The meaning is that the good actions of just men will be remembered long after they are dead and will continue to inspire the posterity. Now please hear an appreciation of the poem. Death the Leveler is a dirge or funeral song which occurs at the end of James Shirley's drama, The Contention of Ajax and Ulysses. It is one of the finest lyrics in English language. A critic has rightly remarked that this poem alone would make Shirley immortal, even if all his other writings were lost. The poem begins with the statement that the glories of birth, parentage, and social position are unreal shadows. They are weak and helpless against man's ultimate destiny. Kings are superior to peasants only when they are alive. but death makes them all equal. Death is thus a great leveler who makes no difference between the great and the small. A king's crown and a peasant's seat are equal before death. There are soldiers who hope to reap the battlefield with swords. After killing their enemies, they plant emblems of victory in the field. But the poet warns them that their strength is not permanent. Sooner or later, their nerves should yield to the cold touch of death. The mighty victors will soon become the sickly prisoners of death. Their physical strength is short lived and will not keep them victors forever. The poet now refers to the brave generals who achieve mighty victories in battles. They send their enemies to death by killing them in large numbers. The poet tells them that their garlands of victory are fast withering. They should stop boasting of their mighty deeds and look at the altar of death, which has become purple with the blood of their enemies. This altar is waiting for the victors themselves. The victors are soon to become the victims of death. Their proud heads are to bow before death in a short while. The last two lines of the poem contain a most significant moral. The poet has already brought out the leveling power of death. Kings and peasants, victors and the defeated are all made equal by death. No human glory remains forever or protects man against his fate. Only the good deeds of just men remain in this world to be remembered by generations to come. The noble actions of men will continue to inspire the posterity. The poet aptly compares these actions to sweet smelling flowers that blossom in the dust in which their doers lie buried. Dear ones, now the poetic techniques used in Death the Leveler. The poem is filled with music. The rhyme scheme used in the poem is AB, AB, CC, DD. This gives more musical quality. The poet very beautifully uses couplets in this poem. You know, a couplet consists of two lines of poetry that rhyme with each other and are of the same length. Two lines rhyme with each other and are of the same length. You can find the couplets here. In the first stanza, scepter and crown must tumble down is a couplet. Scepter and crown must tumble down. In the second stanza, we can find two couplets likewise. Early or late they stoop to fate. Second couplet. And the third couplet, and must give up their murmuring breath when they pale captives creep the death. And the last two lines also a couplet. Only the actions of the just smell sweet and blossom in their dust. Now the figures of speech used in the poem. Personification. Personification is a figure of speech in which human qualities are attributed to inanimate objects. For example, O wild west wind. Example, O wild west wind. Here in personification, human qualities are attributed to inanimate objects. Example, O wild west wind. Now we can find how the poet uses personification here in this poem. See here, you can find in the fourth line, death lays his icy hand on kings. Death lays his icy hand on kings is an example for personification. Now metaphor, a word or expression used to describe somebody or something in a way that is different from its normal use. One is identified with the other. For example, oh, my love is a red, red rose. It's an example of metaphor. How can you change it into a simile? Oh, my love is like a red, red rose. A metaphor really is a word or expression used to describe somebody or something in a way that is different from its normal use. One is identified with the other. That's a metaphor. And the areas where we can find metaphor in this particular poem. The first 1.5 lines is a metaphor. The glories of our blood and state are shadows. It's a metaphor. The glories of our blood and state are shadows. Then come towards the end of the poem. The actions of the just smell sweet. The actions of the just smell sweet. Metonymy. Metonymy is when one thing is mentioned instead of another, with which it has become closely associated because of a recurrent relation in common experience. When one thing is mentioned instead of another, with which it has become closely associated because of a recurrent relation in common experience. Example, the crown stands for a king. Another example, Hollywood stands for the film industry. Now we can find metonymy used in this poem. The usage scepter and crown. Scepter and crown is an example of metonymy here in our poem. Oxymoron is another figure of speech the poet uses in this particular poem. When two terms which in ordinary usage are contraries are used together is oxymoron. When two terms which in ordinary usage are contraries are used together is oxymoron. For example, pleasing pains. Pain is never pleasing, but the usage pleasing pains. Likewise, loving hate. One more example, I burn and freeze. I burn and freeze. So oxymoron is when two terms which in ordinary usage are contraries are used together. So where the poet uses oxymoron in Death the Leveler? See, in the last stanza, you can find the ending part of fourth line. Victor, victim, bleeds. Victor, victim, bleeds. The usage victor, victim, bleeds is an example for oxymoron. Thank you each and everyone for your patient listening and understanding Death the Leveler by James Shirley.